Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our breakout session, A Moment or a Movement is Philanthropy in it for the long haul. We hope you enjoyed our great debate where our two teams discuss whether or not philanthropy has a central role in ending racial inequities. Regardless of how central the role, we do know that philanthropy has a responsibility in this collective movement to end anti-Black racism. And part of that responsibility is funding and supporting the Black organizers on the ground who have been doing this decades-long work to dismantle and reinvent systems whose foundations are built on white supremacy, anti-Black racism, and colonialism. Today, we are so excited to have a dynamic group of panelists discuss how their funds and organizations are stepping up to support the Black-led movement building ecosystem and the ways in which philanthropy can follow suit. Before we get started, I have a bit of housekeeping. If you haven't already, please do take a second to introduce yourself in the chat with your names, pronouns, and organizations. If you don't have your cameras on, please do if you're willing and able, and your mic's muted. We welcome you to use the chat box to ask questions throughout the program, and we will adjust them during the Q&A. As with all of our annual conference content, this session is being recorded, and it is my pleasure to introduce Fred Blackwell, CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, who will be introducing our wonderful panelists and moderating today's conversation. Fred?
Thank you, Nicole. Good to see you. Welcome everybody to the panel. It's really great to be here. As Nicole said, I'm Fred Blackwell. I'm the CEO at the San Francisco Foundation and really looking forward to this conversation. Let me introduce the panelists. First, we have Vinny Bonsali, Executive Director of the Solidaire Network, and Vinny is representing Solidaire's Black Liberation Pooled Fund. Julia Beatty, Director of the Black-led Movement Fund at Borealis Philanthropy. And last but not least, Stuart Burton, who is with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and representing the California Black Freedom Fund. And I gotta say, I'm really excited about today. It is not every day in philanthropy when you get to talk about Black liberation, Black movement, and Black freedom. So welcome everybody to this conversation. Let me just jump right to it, and I have a question for everybody, really. Each one of the funds that we are gonna talk about today has been set up in a non-traditional way in some aspect or another. Can you just tell us how kind of some of your practices and what kind of set the stage for you establishing these funds and kind of what sets them apart from the traditional kind of philanthropic giving that we see? Maybe I'll start with you, Stuart, since you're closest here.
So Fred, I'm going to tell a story that you know well since you were part of it. So first of all, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Northern California grant makers for this conversation. Delighted to be in community and this morning and discussing this work. And Fred, you know this work because it was the Executive Roundtable on Philanthropy and Ethics out of USC that was in conversation about a variety of topics. And then almost exactly a year ago, on May 25th, George Floyd was murdered. And that group decided it was time to act in a collective and a significant way. And the California Black Freedom Fund is the outgrowth of that collective movement. And the action, was spurred. The fund was created with input from several community leaders. So when you read our concept paper, you're reading the words of people who've been doing this work on the ground for many, many years. And so Fred, you asked the question, how is this work different? This is not a group of philanthropists who commissioned a research paper from Ivory Tower who said, what could help? This is work that is really coming from the community. This is what you should be doing philanthropy. This is what we need. This is what would be helpful. And that work translated directly into the 5-year plan of the California Black Freedom Fund. So right there, and we'll get into other ways that it's different, but right there, I say this is a departure from almost anything I've ever done before in philanthropy, because whose idea are we lifting up here? So excited that philanthropy is embracing these ideas finally.
Thanks, Stuart. Who wants to go next?
Go next. Hey everyone, my name's Julia Beatty, pronouns are she and her. And I run the Blacklive Movement Fund at Borealis. I would say what is unique about this fund is that Black movement created the conditions for this fund to exist. It was launched in 2016 in response to the Ferguson uprisings. And there was one bold funder who was looking to respond to the needs that they were hearing from the ground, from young organizers that they had already been resourcing through their portfolio. And wanted to really respond to this growing ecosystem that was developing and emerging, right? Where we had sort of a new wave of Black leadership that wasn't traditional, right? It was Black women, Black queer folks and trans folk, young Black folk who were taking to the streets. And so this fund was designed as a funding vehicle to support that ecosystem, which became the Movement for Black Lives. And the Black-led Movement Fund was funding the Movement for Black Lives when it was still deemed very risky to do as much, right? And of course, risky in quotes, because we pour billions of dollars into systems that don't work for us, like the criminal punishment system, and we don't deem that risky. But we deem folks who are fighting for liberation of Black folk who have been oppressed for centuries here as risky investments. So I would say those two things really, I think, marked the start of this fund. And we're a fund that's very closely coordinated with the M4BL. So we provide unrestricted general operating supports to anchor organizations in the Movement for Black Lives ecosystem. So like a beautiful tapestry of local organizations that are coming together around national projects, around policy, around strategy, around mass mobilization, around addressing patriarchal violence in communities. And so we tailor our grant making strategy and approach to be in alignment with the strategy set forth with the Movement for Black Lives. So in that sense, it's a movement aligned fund. And the fact that we are just funding, radical Black organizing that is unapologetic about calling for what they believe needs to happen, like defunding the police or investing and divesting, I think that definitely feels very non-traditional. Having worked in other places in philanthropy, this feels like a real honor and a privilege and a real rarity, I think, in our field.
Thanks, Julia.
And I can go next. It's such a joy to be with all of you. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about this conversation is because truly nothing Solidaire does is ever alone. It's always in lockstep and an accompaniment with the rest of the sector. I'm Vinee Bhansali. I represent Solidaire Network, which is a community of donors really committed to ending white supremacy and funding social movements for a generation. And so that makes me very proud, because organizing disorganized, unorganized wealth in the United States is part of an important mandate of how our movements have what they need to win. And Solidaire, since its inception 8 years ago, has been committed to cultivating authentic, just and right relationships with Black-led organizing and community leaders, investing in movements so that the transformative work that our movements are doing have what they need to win. But as a community of donors and donor organizers, often Solidaire has committed to moving resources without pulling it together through a collective action vehicle. Last year's uprisings really gave us a mandate from the movement to actually move more dollars, more resources, and not just be satisfied with the couple of million a year that were trickling out of Solidaire into the ecosystem while we were making such commitments to winning. And so the Black Liberation Pooled Fund came out of a real embracing of a strategy around both funding the powerful ecosystem of Black-led change, but also committing to an internal process for donors and people with wealth to do the political education necessary, to have the tools needed to organize their families and their communities into resourcing this movement. So I would say, I'll say a lot more about our grant making as we get through this conversation, but in particular, what I've been really moved and impressed with our community of donors has been their depth of commitment in this moment, and not just talk the talk of racial justice, but to commit with their grant making dollars, their assets, their endowments, and their investments to this liberatory ecosystem that'll save us all.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you all for sharing that. You know, one of the things that has, I guess, struck me among all the things that have struck me over the last year is this conversation going on around power sharing, and more folks on our side of the fence really thinking about and thinking thoughtfully about how to roll these funds out in a way that isn't just about kind of philanthropists going into a back room and cooking stuff up and rolling it out, but actually being in partnership with movement leaders and the folks who are designed to benefit from these funds. Can you all talk about how you all are engaged with your funds in power sharing, kind of in design and accountability and measuring success and those kinds of things? Maybe this time I'll start with you, Vinny, since you were last time.
Thank you, Fred. My colleague Lee Gaiman-Jones is here. Give Lee a shout out. She helped, along with Janice Rocherville, our movement partnerships director. They created a movement oversight committee that truly represents a cross-section of Black internationalist leaders working on all the intersections. Trans organizing, healing, community organizing, farm and land justice work, climate justice work, to really guide our process and help us make really thoughtful field assessments, understand the gaps of where the ecosystem hasn't been resourced adequately, and then make some guidelines that we followed in this Black liberation application process. My colleagues have always been known to challenge Solidaire's network of donors, as well as myself as a leader, in all the positive ways. And one of the things they said was, we insist on doing an open process. Too often, rural groups, youth-led groups get left out of funding applications because they don't hear about it. They don't have adequate development staff. And so a big part of us being accountable to the entire movement ecosystem meant that we really did a depth of outreach that allowed for 2,000 plus applications through our various pooled funds to come in. And my other colleague, Jasenia Santana, is here, who ran the Movement Protection Fund for Solidaire, which in 6 months moved 86 plus grants with an average size of about $50,000 for movement protection. As Jasenia has often made the case, the movement's long-term plans and strategies are at threat if vigilantism and white supremacist violence and far-right violence actually targets our Black leaders and takes them out. And we went through a really heinous period in this country in the last half of 2020, which is not a surprise to any of you on this call, but it made Solidaire really wake up and realize that it's not just enough to make long-term commitments and to fund the ecosystem as we know it, but to also show up in urgent response when the need arises. So those are some of the ways, and we'll discuss some more in a minute.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, our, thinking about accountability, you talked about partnership. For us, well, I'll start by saying this fund was initially designed in partnership with the Movement Strategy Center and individual leaders within new forming organizations that became the Movement for Black Lives. And so this fund continues to work very closely, not only with the M4BL, but also with Solidaire. They were one of our earliest partners when no one was really looking to fund this work. Borealis is an intermediary, which means that we have to raise the money that we are granting out. So while it was sort of initially designed by leaders of the M4BL and the Movement Strategy Center, we continue to engage in close coordination with the M4BL resource table to help refine our grant making criteria, help us identify where resources are most needed, where there's momentum happening in communities, where the M4BL is prioritizing base building and power building in particular communities, like South Florida, like the Midwest. There's a city level strategy that the M4BL is engaging. So we definitely try to be very much aligned as far as our grant making strategy being in alignment with the movement strategy. Part of being aligned with movement is taking their cues around how we think about our own grant making portfolio, right? And so thinking about this particular moment where there's so much momentum around the invest, divest fights, right? Divesting from institutions and systems that have been harmful to Black people, like the criminal punishment system, and investing in mental health supports, community supports. There's so much work that's taking flight, which is really exciting. But because we're in such close partnership with movement colleagues, they're letting us know we need you to be grappling with how you're doing your grant making in a different way. And thinking about if you are a true partner to movement, then you can't be funding things that are actually increasing power for system actors, right? And so, we got some really great guidance from, just recently from our grantees around how we reflect on our invest, divest grant making, right? And so, is our strategy putting more resources into policing, prosecution, and jails, right? And prisons, right? If so, then no, we should not be doing that. That is not in alignment with where movement is right now. Are the people who are leading the work most impacted by criminalization and policing? If the answer is no, right, then we're not resourcing that, right? We need to take a different direction. Does our strategy hinder cross-movement solidarity work amongst people who are impacted by police violence? So being in true partnership with movement means that we're asking different questions about our grant making. And I think it's challenging us, even though we are a non-traditional fund, we are still in a traditional philanthropic formation. And so it's definitely been, I think, very helpful push from movement around how we really think about our work. And I think that's one example I would share around, what alignment looks like and what true partnership looks like with movement, particularly as we're thinking about impact. And, one last thing, you sort of mentioned wins. And I'm talking about impact, and we've been getting tremendous pushback from our grantees around how we talk about wins, right? We are a movement ecosystem funder. Traditionally, philanthropy sort of makes these small grants, $50,000, $100,000, and expects billion-dollar outcomes around dismantling structural racism and white supremacy. So we really have to reframe our thinking around wins and what we're holding grantees accountable to, because so many of the things that we're actually measuring grantees on traditionally in philanthropy are things that we don't even measure ourselves on internally in our own institutions, right? Movements, right, are dealing with not only they're making a lot of gains, but because of those gains are now dealing with incredible backlash. And right, so the movement defense work that folks are doing, in addition to the work that they're moving around the policy table, it's harder, right? So we have to take into account those kinds of things when we're funding movements or Black-led movements that are not only doing great work and winning in some areas, but now the states, they're literal enemies of the state. And we're seeing that in Florida with the passage of HB1 that not only criminalizes protests, but is criminalizing the defund movement itself. Any $1 that is proposed to get shifted away from police into something else now triggers a whole state commission to basically okay if that happens or not, right? So it's in direct response to the incredible work that leaders are having, incredible impact, but we've got to really reframe how we think about win and impact and those things if we really want to be in alignment and be responsive partners to movement.
Thank you, Julia. Lots of powerful messages in there. Stuart.
If we're going to talk about power sharing, it means for those of us who've been in philanthropy, it probably means we need to stop and rethink, our systems, what we're doing. So Silicon Valley Community Foundation is the administrative home of the California Black Freedom Fund, but this is a partnership. This is a funder collective. So when, we have ways of making grants, but we have decided to put those ways aside and ask advice for every step along the way of, how should this work? What should this look like? How do we do this? And again, that is rethinking that sharing. This past Monday, for example, our advisory committee made up of community people, all focused on the California Black Freedom Fund, came together and they talked about, these should be your public policy priorities. And this is how you should think about public policy in this off-election year as we prepare for next year. Julie, you were talking about wins. We were asking them, how do we talk about learning and assessment and wins? And they said, well, this is how you talk about it and this is how you don't. So that feedback is, feeding directly into how this is operating. And, it means that we Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and some of our donors who are watching what we're doing are saying, you know, we take the lesson and we're doing things differently. Another way that I think this is kind of unique is the funders who have put money in have decided they want to stay in. So they don't just want to send the check and, you know, receive the, you know, the occasional report. They're saying, well, what else can we do to help build this effort and help lead this effort? So it's just beyond the check. And again, I've said earlier, I've been in philanthropy a long time, and I've never seen so many senior leaders, CEOs of other foundations jump into an initiative where their own foundation is not the direct beneficiary. But we have a team of folks, Fred is one of them, and they've been coming together to talk about how do we raise money for the California Black Freedom Fund, what's the future direction, how do we govern this new entity in a way that reflects the collective communal philanthropic partnership that is the California Black Freedom Fund. And I just want to shout out to a couple of our partners who are in the room today, because a couple of our donors are here. I just want to say thank you.
All right. Thanks, Stuart, and thanks to all of you all for those thoughtful answers. There were a lot of +1s and +2s and claps coming up in the reaction button. I'll be glad when Zoom adds a snap to the reaction button so that we can use that. You know, Julia, the Black-led Movement Fund is the kind of the OG here among all of the funds. So I want to ask Vinny and Stuart a question. You know, either of you guys are launching new rounds or inaugural rounds of support. Can you all share a little bit about the kind of grantees that are applying and that you anticipate supporting?
Yes, very excited. Next week, it'll be announced publicly. Our colleagues at Solidaire are in the process of finalizing the slate, but it looks like we're going to have about 102 multi-year partnerships with the wide ecosystem of Black-led work in this country. So particularly with a focus on land, climate, Black farmer-led work, many areas of abolition and decarceration work, as well as trans-led organizing. Those are the key intersections that are emerging. Each of our partnerships are going to be 5 years long, and it's just time. Enough has been said about why multi-year general operating support. It's just time to do it. And, you know, it's been interesting to observe our own fear and our own sense of scarcity, even though we organize a network of ultra wealthy people around making multi-year commitments. What if the money is not there? What if, and we have had to really lift up our courage to match the courage of movement and realize the work goes on. We're so fortunate to get to participated in this funding way. So that's the plan. And then for each of our 86 plus grantee partners that receive movement protection funding, also linking them to resources outside of urgent and immediate needs to long-term infrastructure building. Because what those grants reveal to us is that digital and physical security infrastructure needs of our movement leaders and our movement organizations are ever present. If something is cyclical, it's philanthropy's commitment. It's very seasonal and often short-term, and then forgetting why infrastructure needs long-term investment. So that's our commitment. 188 new grantee partners through the Black Liberation Pooled Fund announcing next week, and a lot of learning ahead of us. One of the most revealing part for Solidaire in this has been what has been asked of us. We really have to step up now. Each of our grantee partners has been very clear in articulating what kind of partnership they expect from Solidaire, how they expect us to show up. What more can we do other than making these grants? Everything from learning exchanges to strategizing together with other sectors of the movement. So very excited and looking forward to meeting the vibrancy of the movement.
Very exciting, congrats.
That's super exciting. At the California Black Freedom Fund, we just wrapped up round 2 of our open RFP and received, as of last Friday, 172 applications. And you might wonder why only 172. Well, we heard from the community in terms of like this next step, that the groups who needed our help the most right now were small groups who were struggling with the economics brought on by the pandemic, or just, just struggling. And they said, if you want these groups to be around and doing the work that they're doing, then you need to put your arms around them. So that came directly from the community. So we said, let's focus on organizations with budgets less than 1 million across the state of California, knowing that we will hopefully have, the resources to focus on some of the larger veteran organizations down the road. But these 172 come from all over the state. They're angling in from all kinds of different issues, from housing, from food security, from educational programs. Interestingly, and I love hearing themes, Vinny, it makes me know that, we really are in community together, because interestingly, a couple of groups came back and really tested, what are we allowed to do with this money? It's like, it is flexible operating support. Well, by flexible, what do you mean? What are you expecting? And we have really set people up, as grant makers to try to find that answer. And then we said, no, flexible. And again, Vinny, multi-year operating support. And then they said things like, and we said, well, what do you need? And they said, well, there's stuff that we need like this, not very exciting, like, computer security. Our systems are vulnerable. Can we use the money for that? We're like, yes, you can. So it is interesting to see the behavior, to kind of like see the progression that people go through to test. Are you really meaning flexible operating support? And we'll work with a group of a committee of 11, representing several different funding partners to look through these applications and then whittle it down to everything that our budget will allow us to fund and announce next month as part of a Juneteenth celebration. So I'm really excited to be helping these organizations, strengthen themselves and, be in this for the long haul.
Thanks, you all. It's funny, Stuart, we've been providing so much categorical, structured support to partners for so long that when we say we're ready to do general operating support, they don't even believe us. Julia, can you talk a little bit about, or share a little bit, you touched on it a little bit, can you share a little bit more about your partners and the work that they're doing and how it kind of aligns with the movement and protest work that's happening around the country right now?
Sure, yeah. So really exciting because there's so much amazing work happening. And we see ourselves as funding the hubs of the center of activity that's sort of giving birth to more activity. So if I were more tech savvy, I would throw up a map real quick, but I don't want to mess up the Zoom. But we did some assessment of where we're funding both the Blacklive Movement Fund and also our Communities Transforming Policing Fund, which is also another movement fund at Borealis that I work closely with. We are resourcing Black-led organizations who do work to decriminalize and decarcerate. And we overlaid a map of our grantees with a map of the New York Times did data collection to identify where protest activity was happening all over the United States on one day on June 6th. And we took those places, those locations, and overlaid it onto where our grantees were. And there was a lot of synergy, which tells us, right, that the grant making that we're doing as an ecosystem approach, right, it shows us that these anchor organizations of the Movement for Black Lives and others are actually helping to give birth to new organizing, new formations, new political formations, a lot of there's so much now potential for folks to be able to sort of step in and resource this incredible body of work around Invest Divest around the country. And so our approach at the Blacklive Movement Fund is really, we want to fund a healthy ecosystem. And so for us, that's not just investing in base building and organizing, or direct action support like the Blackout Collective, they're based in the Bay, or Action St. Louis that's doing incredible work, electoral organizing. I mean, the way that their political map in St. Louis has changed is a direct result of the organizing of Action St. Louis and others. But we're also supporting movement lawyering, right? So Law for Black Lives, and movement lawyers that are in relationship with movement, not just like legal advocates that are doing work not in true partnership with movement communities. We're funding research like interrupting criminalization that's created a whole incredible body of new resources for organizers that are wanting to do this work around defund in their communities, but need a starting point. We are funding cultural production. So we just started funding Spirit House in North Carolina that's doing work around harm-free zones in Durham, and are very active in the Durham Beyond Policing coalition. And they've got some really exciting stuff happening locally, but they're also bringing in elements of Black culture and spiritual practices so that Black people and organizers can see themselves in the work, which has not always been the case. Leadership development, Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity. They're one of our longtime grantees. They're doing incredible work to support organizers who are really burnt out and have a lot going on, to be able to be well-connected, centered, grounded. Very excited about all the work that we're supporting. And then, for me, when I hear from some of our grantees, going back to the win piece, right? For me, when the Black Trans Nation reached out to me, number one, they're winning legislatively, right? So they were very instrumental in being able to repeal the walking while trans law that existed in New York State for many, many years, which is a way to racially and gender profile Black trans women in particular, and throw them in jail for sex work, right? Whether or not that was the case. So they were very active in repealing that, which, yay, a win. But for me, it was a win when I was able to check in with them. They said, because of the grant making and the deep support that you're offering, right? Like 6-figure support for an organization that's brand new. This means that some of the folks that were our volunteers can actually get paid to do what they do. And they no longer have to do sex work. They actually can get the resources that they need to organize their communities. And ultimately, I feel like that's what our work as funders ought to be, is to get folks the resources that they need so that they could staff up, so that their organizers and their staff are cared for. They have health insurance, they have paid time off, right? They have all that they need to be able to go out there and fight the good fight, right? That's our role, not really to get all involved in the, in the policy strategy of it all. At least that's my philosophy. But it's really, listening to what movement says are the sort of the different elements of what makes a healthy ecosystem and resourcing those accordingly. And, many of our grantees are in partnership with so many amazing other organizations in their community. And through those relationships with grantees, I'm constantly meeting new folks, right? And it's a sort of a network mining approach to also how we're identifying new groups all the time. We're funding those folks that are in partnership with our grantees too.
Love it. It is so inspiring to hear you all describe the work that's coming out of these funds. Over the last year, the climate has really saw a big introduction of kind of new funds into the ecosystem, and folks that have been doing the work for a while, their funds have been kind of brought to a higher level of relief. Can you all talk about kind of what the collaboration looks like in this ecosystem now? How are the funds kind of working with one another, bouncing ideas? Where's the synergy?
Fred, I don't know if you know, but there's a group called in formation being called the Freedom Funders. And this is a nationwide collective of us, and I think Borealis is, all across the country, those of us who are funding Black liberation, Black freedom work. And how can we be mutually supportive of each other and share lessons with each other? And it's so interesting because when I talk to sometimes a funder, prospective contributor to the California Black Freedom Fund, they say, well, what about, this other entity? They do that work too. How do you feel about what they're doing? And you can almost hear they're expecting me to say something kind of passive aggressive, a little critical, so that, the money can come my way. And I say, I think they do great work, and I love being, love reading about them. And Juliet, hearing what you're funding right now, that is so inspiring. And And so these freedom funders, that's what we're going to do, sit around and talk about what we're doing, what's working, how we can support one another. And I thought, well, how many folks are there? And we're going to come together again in June for our second gathering, and 35 different initiatives across the country will be represented. And I think that's fantastic. And I hope it continues to grow, because we have so much to offer and learn from each other, and super exciting.
That totally resonates. I'll just start by saying last year, when we decided to create the Black Liberation Pooled Fund as a response to what felt like foundations, particularly that were new to giving to Black-led work, leaving money on the table, if you will, and or not knowing where to direct it, coming to Solidaire for advisement. And our first line of work was to say, go to Borealis. They do it. They've been at it. We trust them. And often there would be a reaction of like, why, because Solidaire's pooled funds were really meant for our members. And even now, it's like when you sign on to give through the Black Liberation Pooled Fund, it's an expectation that you're also engaging in a Black liberatory learning exercise, and not everybody's up for that. That our expectation on the donor organizing and political education sides are to engage in that way and to be responsible to organize others with wealth. And it's been a real joy to be able to say, but there are these sister funds and there are these organizations that we deeply trust that move in a movement aligned way. Lots of excitement on our team when the California Black Freedom Fund was formed. We also played an advisory role in the Democracy Frontlines Fund. We've also, were Julia and I together, part of Freedom Funders. And so I think that amongst those of us that feel a depth of accountability to work and operate in a movement building way, there is collaboration. But I would be amiss if I didn't say that's a very small sector of us that is collaborating and thinking together and trying to support and lift each other's work up. Philanthropy overall still continues to play into some really hard competitive dynamics that ultimately don't get resources in the hands of the movements and the organizers that deserve them. And so I think that there's a mandate for us, those of us that are working as philanthropic organizers and that have sectoral influence, to actually up the ante here. We really have to set the standard much higher, to not just talk collaboration, but to make it so.
Yeah, and I'll just add, well, first of all, I love Solidaire so much because back in 2017, it was Solidaire and the Movement for Black Lives resource table and myself. And anytime there was a workshop at a conference where funders were going to be, we were going to be delivering that workshop so that we could, amplify this work, right? Because there wasn't a whole lot of interest then, or at least the interest that sort of was there immediately after the Ferguson uprising sort of dwindled away. And so, partnerships. So I always want to shout out Solidaire, because when there weren't a lot of folks out here hustling and grinding to get these coins, right, and redirect those to movement, Solidaire, and Janice in particular, was an incredible partner in that. And Freedom Funders is really amazing. Funders for Justice is another network. And I think what many of us are really yearning for and need are communities of practice where we can engage with other funders around how we're shifting the sector. Because, myself, I'm a director in a foundation that also has a board, right? We have donors that have come to our fund who have pooled resources, who have had to really push internally in their own institutions to get their execs and their boards to really understand why this work matters and has value, right? So these communities of practice are really important for us to be able to get together as peers to really think about how we're pushing up, how we support each other and flank one another as we're moving within our own institutions to try to gain more recognition and resources for this work. So I'm really excited about the upcoming, I hear the design team is dope. So I'm really excited for us getting together. And I think in follow-up, we can probably share some information with the NCG team if there are folks who have interest in joining that formation.
Great, thank you. Got one more question, and then I want to get it engaged with the audience on some Q&A. So folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. You know, among the kind of many features of white supremacy is the way that in philanthropy at least, a divisive system gets set up where, you know, funding of this sort that goes to, you know, racially specific groups only kind of pops up when there's a crisis and then goes back to normal, and we never kind of really meet the need for sustained support. Can you all talk about why it's important both to meet the moment and respond to crisis, but also not limit the support that goes to Black-led or AAPI-led or Latinx-led stuff to that moment when that community is in crisis?
You know, that, Fred, was the question that we heard almost most often, you know, during the creation of the California Black Freedom Fund. It's like, well, you know, you're doing this because of what's happening today, but where are you all going to be in a year? What's going to be happening in a couple of years? And, you know, it is a conversation that we had to have with our supporters and let them know that, you know, as we talked about earlier, you can't expect this work to be accomplished in 1 or 2 years, and your funds are going to be needed now. Interestingly, the question, you know, I get 2 sets of questions around the California Black Freedom Fund. One is, what if you don't raise the $100 million? And that's 1/3 of the people. And I said, well, we just passed the 40 million mark. We're not quite a year old, and you know, we expect to get there. 2/3 of the people are asking, like, well, why isn't this a fund in perpetuity? You know, our state, our country needs this kind of support to go on forever. Why are you only thinking about 5 years? So it's very interesting that, you know, I think there has been a shift, that we want to move beyond the moment. This is not episodic funding. We're not just reacting to one event. You know, we really understand that to make the changes that we're talking about, it's going to take time, it's going to take investment, and it's going to take, you know, really, you know, working, you know, arm in arm with these organizations. It is nice to see, I think, a shift in philanthropy that recognizes that this is what it's going to take to accomplish what we want.
Yeah, you know, so Black-led movement work it's a long game, right? I think for many folks in philanthropy, this feels like a moment. But for those Black movement leaders and those of us who are Black people, right? Like, we understand that, you know, the calls for abolition or defunding the police are directly connected to the work to abolish slavery, right? Like, this is the work that Black organizers have been doing to fight for democracy, has been in the works for the last 400 plus years, right? The abolition of slavery, the 14th Amendment, right? Like, that was a result of Black organizers and activists in 1868 coming together to force this country to amend the Constitution to allow for birthright citizenship, right? So that Black people and others, right? And others benefited from that, could be able to have rights recognitions and resources, right? So, you know, I think we have to really kind of reframe philanthropy's thinking around this moment, because it really is a movement. I think that's our title of our talk today, Moment to Movement. And it's to really sort of situate this work in the long game, and to be able to see the connections between the work that Black organizers and leaders have been doing for centuries around fighting for, you know, to make the United States stay true to what it put on paper, right? Around the democratic ideals. And so I think it's important to always sort of situate this work in that context. And, you know, there's definitely, I have heard, you know, some pushback, right, in our sector around, you know, well, why just center Black folks? What about, you know, there's other folks in other communities. And I think we need to be thinking about just decentering whiteness in philanthropy, right? And what that means is listening to Black folk, it's listening to BIPOC folk, and listening, not to reply, right? Not to say, oh, well, that's great. Well, how does this fit in my grant making strategy? But really listening to understand how we need to show up for movement, right? And, you know, and I think centering Black organizing in your grant making can take so many forms. There's so many entry points: democracy funders, civic engagement funders, people who are funding arts and culture. I mean, there are so many ways that Black organizers and leaders have contributed to such a richness in all of our movements, right? And they intersect, right? It's not just Black communities. Black folks are leading LGBTQ movements. Black trans people have been critically important to LGBT communities getting the gains that we have gotten so far, right? So I think we've got to really definitely do work. And I really appreciate what Solidaire does, because they do deep political education with their members around this kind of this broader analysis around what it is that we're actually stepping in to fund. So I think we need more of that in our sector.
That's an assist if I've ever seen one, Vinny. Go ahead.
Oh, that's so kind. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, Stuart and Julia have covered all the reasons. And I'll just say for a 230 plus member community of donors who are really serious about reparations, redistribution, confronting white supremacy and right-wing consolidation of power head on, there is an implicit understanding that we get behind at Solidaire, which is that we all get free when Black folks get free. And there is no other path to collective liberation in the United States without the power of Black folks. And it means something to us to understand that and practice that Black-led organizing also means multiracial resistance and alternatives for all of us to participate in and to engage with. And it's a sophisticated movement ecosystem that has a lot to teach us. One of the things that has been so moving in this process of opening up applications and receiving things from rural Arkansas and Mississippi and from the deep, deep South, and to see the level of innovation and excitement and creative work that folks are leading, that just a little bit of resources goes a long way in flanking in meaningful ways. Yesterday, Lee and I were talking and we realized that if we weren't in this artificial process of having to whittle down from the applications to the ones that we could make significant multi-year commitments to, if we could actually fund everybody that applied, that's doing great work, that passes muster of our due diligence, et cetera, we're looking at $100 million a year. And so I thank you, Stuart, for setting a $100 million goal. I thank you, Julia, for always being willing to meet the moment with more resources and consistently. And I think for Solidaire's theory of liberation, our commitment to moving $1 billion in the next 10 years to movement just feels like a start. Does not even feel that ambitious anymore, given what is happening, the scale and scope of work that's happening in this country.
All right, one of our first questions here. Once upon a time, there were just a few donor advised fund options, and they were mostly hosted at community foundations. Then they began proliferating pretty quickly and were co-opted by the private sector. And now we find ourselves in a place where donors feel overwhelmed about all the choices and how to distinguish them. The question is kind of how do we increase the flow of money to pooled funds without creating that same level of overwhelm in terms of the number of choices that there are out there?
Can you actually repeat that question? I'm sorry, I'm still chomping on that one.
Yeah, just I guess the question is kind of how do we simultaneously kind of bring all these funds to higher relief and encourage more flow into them. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, not overwhelm folks with the variety of options that there are out there to support these kinds of funds.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think it's great to have a variety of options, right? Because the needs are so great that a few funds, right, just the Black Lives Movement Fund and the Black Liberation Pool Fund and the California Freedom Fund, right, alone, and plus, you know, Grantmakers of Girls of Color just launched the Black Girls Fund, right? Those alone aren't going to nearly get to the resource needs of community. And I think I appreciate the diversity of funds that are focused on different aspects of resourcing Black-led work. And I think donors, right, depending on where you sit, have different motivations for joining. For Solidaire, they're bringing together individuals, right, who are deeply committed to unlearning their own whiteness, right, and moving money in a coordinated and a long-term way. Borealis, a lot of folks join our fund because you know, we're a foundation, right? And so it feels a little less risky, perhaps. We might give a little cover for program officers or directors to be able to move money to our fund in a way that resources work that perhaps they might not be able to get buy-in from their board, you know, abolition organizing work, let's say, for example. And I think there's other funds that are doing really, like I'm thinking about the Amplify Fund with NFG that's funding in particular places in the Midwest that have been historically under-resourced. So, you know, I haven't I've I haven't spent my whole career in philanthropy, so I'm not as familiar with the dynamic, but I will say I personally appreciate the proliferation of all of these opportunities. I think the folks on the ground are eager, to Vinny's point earlier, like are looking for more opportunities to get resources, right? And so I think this is a great thing for our sector.
I don't want to minimize the question, but I was just thinking the same thing, Julia. This is what we would call today a good problem. We've got so many good choices of where to put, resources. And just like you would due diligence on any other issue, I mean, you find one that really speaks to you, aligns with you, has the focus, has the longevity, has the X factor that really, matches your interests as a funder. And I appreciated earlier, the point about referring other, how we refer to others and how others refer to us. That point can't be overmade. I was so moved when the Democracy Frontline Fund came to us when we were starting, saying like, tell us more about what you're doing, and we'll tell you more what we're doing. And then at the end of it, it was basically, we want you all to be successful. And I said, that's great. They're like, no, we're not just saying that. Here's a grant. We want you all to be successful. This is a grant from the Democracy Frontlines Fund to the California Black Freedom Fund. We're going to work together. We're going to all, we have more than enough work to do among us. So let us support one another. So going back, I would just say to that person, we're happy to talk to you, answer your questions. And I personally, if I hear that you've got a donor that's looking for a deep educational experience, something like Solidaire offers that we don't have yet or not planning to develop, I will not, hesitate to say, I think you should call our friends at Solidaire, for example.
All right. Well, what started as a trickle of questions is starting to turn into a waterfall. And so I'm gonna try to move through them, and maybe all of us won't try to answer them at the same time. Maybe we'll have a chance to get through. What opportunities are you seeing to further organize the funders and donors in these funds? So for example, can it influence their kind of bigger grant making portfolio? Are there changes in practices that participation in this fund can help to kind of galvanize the support?
Yes. Yes, right? I feel like, I see my work in philanthropy also as an advocate, and trying to push our sector to do better, right? So we're always doing work to try to educate our donors around, where movement is right now, what they're asking of us, and how they're asking us to show up. How we're thinking about, for example, capacity building, right? It's an important role and a resource that funders can offer, right? But, like we've gotten pushback from the M4BL, friendly pushback because these are our comrades, right? But hey, you're asking us these questions around our capacity. So we have some questions about your capacity. We want to know, how are you all engaging and evaluating what you all are doing around your grant making practices? How are you all thinking about resource allocation, right? So it's sort of turning the questions back on us. But I think ultimately we're looking to build, to bring folks together, to bring more resources into this work in a way that is aligned with what movement says that they need, that is not just stroking our own institution's ego, right? Because philanthropy is rife with that. Our project or our strategy, right? It really is being humble enough to walk and follow movement leaders and raising resources to that end. So, but yes, definitely changing our practices. I think some folks are finally, last year we saw what was possible, at least I did. We had funders reach out to us that said, hey, we want to move money to you and you don't even have to fill out a proposal. I was floored. So if we could do this in a time of major crisis and upheaval, I think we could probably figure out how we do this, always as a general practice.
A quick story.
This question, Stuart, go ahead.
No, just a quick story, Fred, in terms of other foundations and, learning along with this. So while we were raising money for the California Black Freedom Fund, so many institutional foundation leaders said, hey, keep us posted with what you're learning. And by the way, maybe I can call you, or we can, set up a Zoom call or something just to check in. I got this so often. I said, well, what's going on? We're trying to think about our own work within, the foundation and some of our practices, some, questions around our culture. So we decided, well, let's just pull all these donors and people who are doing, on this journey together. And at this point in February, we had about 22 donors. So we thought, well, at the CEO level, because I wanted to talk CEO to CEO, we thought, well, that's an invitation list of about 22 people. And to our surprise and delight, they start saying, can we bring someone? I'm going to bring my vice president of this, my director of that. 50 people came, and it was a learning. It was a learning community. It was not performative. I would say it was about tell us what's working, tell us what we can, take back and try and think about for our own institution. And again, I just think that's a wonderful departure that is stimulated by the work that we're all doing here on the screen.
Benny, I want to direct maybe the next question to you. What are the resources that you would point to help staff and advisors with making the case, particularly the trustees and individual donors that may be able to get folks over the barriers to making these commitments long-term?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking that. I was last year really inspired by M4BL's institutional donors and also individual donor solidarity pledge that they put out, and we're going to try to find a link and share it with everybody. And basically what the Movement for Black Lives, the resource table that Julia, Janice, others are represented on from Philanthropy as well. They basically put out a set of practices that I thought were compelling, clear, on point, and that were really helpful. They talked about finding clarity and trusting Black leadership and what it can look like in practice, giving more regularly and consistently. They talked about giving new and better money. I think there was a quote in that pledge that said, your giving cannot be at the cost of another liberation movement. Shift your language from solely responding to needs to a more expansive strategy rooted in abundance. A critical other invitation was to organize with peer funders, right? So minimize the labor on movement leaders and let us, those of us that have professional jobs paid for by philanthropy, let's do more to organize resources ourselves, take that upon ourselves rather than always rush to put movement leaders' time and labor in front of people. And then internally in our organization, supporting our Black staff, making sure that they're in leadership roles and are visible in their important roles, ensuring that we don't continue to perpetuate the mythology of fake funder budgets, and we can have a whole other discussion about that. And not inventing capacity building programs that are donor driven. Movement knows its capacity. Between all of us, we're funding an ecosystem of Black-led capacity builders and leadership developers that know what's up. We don't need to start a funder program in that direction. And so all of these are really, in some ways, commonsensical principles, but something happens inside of our organizations, inside of our donor networks, inside of our funding portfolios where we forget the basic principles. So I appreciated the reminder that we have to remember that ours is a role to play. And I think when it comes to trustees, because many of Solidaire members are in fact trustees in decision-making roles, I would say peer-to-peer support is really critical. We have trustees within Solidaire that have made 10-year commitments that went from not knowing anything about the Black liberation ecosystem to within 1 year making 10-year multi-million-dollar commitments to the Black liberation ecosystem and then bringing their entire family trustee body along. I, as a philanthropic professional, would not have been able to do that. What peers have been able to do with their own families and their own trustee bodies. And so it is really critical to also invite trustees, especially the ones that are already champions or at the edge of becoming champions, and arm them and skill them up with the resources they need to organize others. We run entire programming around family organizing and trustee influence within Solidaire, but so do many other donor networks. So I would say, make sure to not leave your trustees disorganized. If there's one thing I suggest you do, have them talk to other rich people. It's really, really, really critical.
Got it, thank you. There's a question here about kind of the importance of distinguishing Black-led versus Black power building in terms of the focus of some of these things. It says, it seems like the terms Black-led and Black power building are sometimes used interchangeably, especially among white philanthropists. And it seems like it's an important important to distinguish between the two. Why is it important to both think about increased support to Black-led organizations, but also have support that is specifically focused in on kind of building Black power?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think Black power building is a particular strategy, right? A particular set of strategies that we might be resourcing, organizing, base building, skilling people up around their ability to make political assessments, right? And community assessment, develop policy solutions. So, and power building often doesn't get funded in our sector, whether it's Black-led or not, right? Or at least it's relatively new over the last, decade or so, the more money supporting organizing work. I remember a time where I worked at the Ms. Foundation for Women in 2005, and we were trying to make the case that youth organizing is youth development, right? So if you want to fund youth development, then organizing and power building is too. And so thankfully we're not there anymore, right? And more folks are investing in the power building. I think that's really important because not a lot of resources go there. But Black-led, right, there's a whole ecosystem of work, as I mentioned earlier, right? And so that they're also important to resource. However, I think it's also very important to note that, you don't just fund Black-led for Black-led sake either, right? So the movement for Black Lives, to bring them forth again, they've done incredible work engaging hundreds of organizations over many years to develop a values and a framework, right? For what they believe in and what their North Star is, right? And I think they've already done incredible work to sort of give us a lens through which we can even, evaluate the Black-led organizations that are coming to us, right? Are these organizations that are sharing power in community and building community power, right? Are women represented in their leadership? Are trans and queer folk represented as well? Are they actively involved in sort of unlearning homophobia, transphobia in their organizations? I think, those are important, I think, criteria, at least for me and for this fund, when we're funding Black-led, right? So, move lots of money to Black work, and let's make sure that this work is in service of liberation for our people, right? And I think we could look to the M4BL and other movement partners to help us with that sort of litmus test.
Benny, Stewart, anything to add there? All right, Julie, you dropped the mic on that one.
That was a great answer.
All right. Well, I'll ask kind of one more question here. What's the role of funders in helping to strengthen and sustain the capacity of Black-led movement work in Black communities overall?
Well, as a non-Black person who is committed day in and day out to funding this ecosystem, I want to say this, right? For those of us in philanthropy, it's time to truly leave behind the rules and fund social movements so that Black-led groups have what they need to understand that 10 years from now, those of us who actually care about freedom, democracy, human dignity, justice, look back, we want to be in a position to celebrate and say that when this movement asked us to step up and step in for our collective liberation, that we replied with the most historical and resounding yes. And the mandate is clear, not only for our Black leaders in funding, but actually for those of us that are in positions of power to influence that aren't Black, but are committed to Black liberation as collective liberation. So my call is to all the folks on this call who aren't Black, who don't have to carry racialized trauma and overburdened responsibility for Black freedom in their bodies. We have a job to do, and let's really step up.
I'll jump in. What is the role of philanthropy? What can funders do? I'll say a couple of things, and I'm borrowing from the Monday Advisory Committee. Some wise words were spoken that day, and I was taking good notes. Commit to the fight. Join us in the fight when it's not just when it's fashionable, but when it's not. If this is not on the front page next year, hopefully you still are asking the same questions about how do we make these changes in the community. And then what funders can do is, I just would say, listen, learn, and adapt. Come at this with a very open mindset, understanding where we've been philanthropically, some things we have had success with, others we have not. This is an area of work where most of us agree that new approaches are needed. So if you, come with that mindset, I think that, it bodes well for a good conversation and the alignment of expectations in such a way that, we can move forward together in a meaningful way.
Julie, you want to tackle that one too?
Sure. The question was around capacity that is needed to sustain this work over the long haul, right? And
Yeah.
what funders do. Yeah, I mean, I think Vinny and Stuart hit it. We got to counter the boom bust cycle that is like very, that is the way that we often do our work. When this fund, the Blacklive Movement Fund, was launched, it was at a time there wasn't a whole lot of donor interest in funding Black-led organizing, but there were some. But then, as folks left the streets, well, they didn't really leave the streets, but as long as it was less visible, right, to folks, the money started drying up a little bit, right? And then funders, oh, well, I don't really like their political statement over here, and oh, I kind of disagree with their tactics there. And actually investing in this work means whether or not, trusting Black folk and Black leaders means whether or not you agree or not, you move those resources because you trust that they know what is best for communities, right? And so that means, I think, to what Stuart was speaking to, there are going to be quiet times, right? They're going to be like right now. Not everybody got a whole lot of money, but there's some groups that got resourced in a significant way for the first time ever. So now they're building staff. They've got to hire folks, right? So, a year from now, like if you're going back to the group that you just started funding and wondering, well, why they haven't solved, XYZ policy issue in their community, well, folks are building infrastructure, they're building their organizations up. And so we have to understand that we can't just be resourcing this movement when it's highly visible and in the streets, right? We have to sustain this work. I think these communities of practice, like these networks that are developing amongst philanthropy, are going to be really useful. And I think we can continue to learn from one another about the kind of political education tools that other folks are using inside of their institutions to help bring folks along, right? To understand that this is a long game. It's not just a moment, right? And then again, like I said, there's multiple points of entry. No matter what your grant making strategy is, no matter where you are based, there are Black people doing some work on those issues, on those strategies, and it's really just about opening up your eyes and listening to folks that you're also funding to try to identify who they are. And so we need to keep investing in the quiet times as well, particularly when people are building infrastructure, because that's what's going to help them get to the next level of the work.
Well, you all, we have reached the end. Vinny, Julia, Stuart, I really want to thank you all for your boldness. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for the thoughtfulness with which you are approaching this work. And let's hope that the things that you're doing go viral in the field. Really want to thank you all for the time that you've spent here. And Nicole, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Fred. You actually took a lot of my closing remarks. And I want to just say that this has been such an amazing hour. A huge thank you to Fred for moderating for us, Vinny, Julia, Stuart, not only for this powerful conversation, but for the work that you all are doing to prove that philanthropy really can be in it for the long haul. And lastly, thank you to my NCG colleagues, Alice and Marissa, for being so central in designing and supporting this session today. We will be sending out resources in our post-conference email. I believe that Alice just put a link in the chat for our post breakout session survey. If you could take 2 to 3 minutes to complete it, it would mean a lot to us. And just so you know, we have one final 15-minute break before our membership meeting at 12:30, where we will celebrate NCG's 40th anniversary and announce our board slate. We hope you can stick around and join us for that, and we'll see you on day 2 of our conference. Thanks, everyone.